I don't really like to comment about that because it's kind of pointing the finger at somebody else. You know, hey, I should have caught the ball, so that's all I really care about. The situation with the runner on second base and 2 outs, I was playing deeper than I normally play with someone that can run like Mookie. So
Bill Buckner names 5 players he will never forgive. Or at least that is the story people have spent years trying to sell. The ball comes off the bat of Mookie Wilson. It skips once, it skips twice, then it rolls toward first base, where Bill Buckner is waiting with his knees bent and his glove down low. The crowd at Shea Stadium is screaming, packed in tight, desperate for one more out. Flashbulbs are already going off in the stands. Boston needs just one more out right now to win the World Series and end a wait that had lasted almost 70 years. Buckner reaches down for the ball. It slides between his legs. It rolls into shallow right field. Ray Knight sprints home. The Mets win the game. In one single moment, 22 years of hard work turn into the most replayed mistake in baseball history. And as we uncover the 5 names tied to that night, use the hype feature and give this video some hype so more fans can hear the full story. Before that ball ever reached him, Bill Buckner had already proven himself as one of the toughest hitters the game had ever seen. He played through pain that would have ended most careers years earlier. He kept swinging. He kept getting hits. He kept showing up, night after night, season after season, long after other players his age had already walked away from the game and gone home for good. That is the part of the story most people forget when they only remember the error. So before we place any blame on him for what happened that night, it helps to understand exactly who Bill Buckner was, what he had already given to the sport across a very long career, and why the ending felt so shocking and so sudden to everyone who was watching at home that October night. The story people tell about him rarely starts here, at the beginning, and that is exactly the problem with how this whole story usually gets told. Bill Buckner did not stumble into a great career. He built one, brick by brick, over 22 seasons, from 1969 all the way through 1990. Think about that stretch of time for a moment. That is more than 2 full decades of stepping into the batter's box against the very best pitchers on the planet. Over that time, Buckner collected 2,715 hits, a number that places him among the top 70 hitters in the entire history of Major League Baseball. He finished with a career batting average of .289, built carefully across 9,397 official at-bats. In 1980, while playing for the Chicago Cubs, he won the National League batting title outright with an average of .324. That is not a lucky hot streak that fades after a few weeks. That is a hitter standing at the very top of his craft for an entire long summer, facing every pitcher the league had to offer. Buckner also drove in more than 100 runs in a single season on 2 separate occasions, proving he could do far more than simply slap easy singles into the outfield. He was the kind of player a manager could trust to put the bat on the ball in almost any situation. Across more than 10,000 plate appearances, he struck out only 453 times in his entire career. That works out to a strikeout rate of just 4.8%, an astonishingly low number. Almost nobody in the modern game makes contact like that. In 1985, Buckner played 162 games at first base, tying a major league record for durability at that position in one season. He simply did not miss games. He played hurt, he played tired, he played anyway, night after night, because that is who he was as a professional. That kind of career deserves genuine respect before anything else is said about the man behind it. But greatness does not erase mistakes, and the mistake that came later hit the public so much harder precisely because the career before it had been so consistently strong for so long. Nobody expected a player with that many hits, that many years, and that much discipline at the plate to become known, above everything else he had ever done, for one baseball rolling through his legs on a cold October night in New York. The higher the respect a player earns across a long career, the harder the fall feels to the people watching it happen live on television. There is one more strange detail from before the World Series that makes this whole story feel almost impossible to believe. 19 days before Game 6, on October the 6th, 1986, Buckner sat down for an interview with a reporter. He talked openly and honestly about the pressure of playing in October, when every single pitch can decide an entire season for a whole city. He said the dream was simple, to have a great series and to win it all together with his teammates. Then he said something almost impossible to believe now. He said the nightmare was letting the winning run score on a ground ball that rolled straight through his own legs. He said those exact words before the World Series had even started, weeks before Game 6 was even played. 3 weeks later, that precise nightmare came true, in exact detail in front of millions of people watching on television across the entire country. To understand why that single ground ball mattered so much, you have to travel back to the very start of the 10th inning that night. It was October the 25th, 1986. The game was being played at Shea Stadium in New York, in front of a loud, desperate, and increasingly hopeful home crowd. The Boston Red Sox walked into that inning, leading 5-3, with the finish line finally in sight after a long and difficult season. Dave Henderson had just hit a home run in the top half of the inning to give Boston that lead, sending the Boston dugout into celebration mode early. The team stood 3 outs away from something the entire city of Boston had waited 68 long years for, a World Series championship that had felt cursed for generations. Calvin Schiraldi, a young pitcher who had only recently taken over as Boston's closer, was on the mound, and he started the inning the exact way every Red Sox fan in the world hoped he would. He got the first out cleanly. Then he got the second out just as cleanly. 2 outs, nobody on base, and the celebration already beginning to build in the stands. Boston needed just one more out to finally end the long drought that had haunted the franchise for 2 generations. At that exact moment, based on how thousands of similar situations across baseball history usually play out, Boston's chance of winning the World Series stood at 99.8%. That is about as close to a sure thing as the game of baseball ever gets, for any team in any situation. But there was a decision made earlier that day, quietly, almost without notice, that would end up mattering more than almost anyone realized in the moment. Bill Buckner was not a fully healthy baseball player by that point, late in his long career. He was dealing with serious chronic ankle problems and real structural damage in both feet, damage that required heavy taping and specially built shoes just to get him onto the field at all before every single game. Because of that ongoing physical toll, throughout the regular season that year, manager John McNamara had developed a clear habit. Whenever Boston held a lead late in a game, he would often take Buckner off the field defensively and bring in Dave Stapleton, a younger player with far better range and healthier legs, purely to protect that lead in the late innings. It was a normal, sensible baseball decision, used again and again throughout the entire season without much controversy attached to it. But in Game 6, with the World Series sitting right there on the line for the taking, McNamara did something different from his usual pattern. He left Buckner in the game at first base. According to later accounts of that decision, he wanted his loyal veteran first baseman to be standing out there on the field if Boston won it all, so that Buckner could share fully in the celebration after everything he had already given the team across his career. It was a kind, sentimental thought from a manager who clearly respected his player and what he had sacrificed. It was also, without anyone fully realizing it in that moment, a real defensive risk. A player with genuinely limited mobility was left standing at first base during the single biggest defensive moment of the entire season, and nobody yet knew exactly how much that quiet decision would come to matter before the night was finally over. The first player who had a real chance to end that entire inning cleanly, and simply did not, was Calvin Schiraldi. He started the 10th inning exactly the way Boston needed him to start it. He retired Wally Backman on a routine play near the infield. He retired Keith Hernandez, the Mets captain, and one of the most respected hitters in the entire league, right after that with very little trouble. Boston stood one single out away from finally ending the championship drought that had haunted the franchise for so many long years. A drought that had turned into a running joke, and a real source of pain for generations of fans who had never seen their team win it all. Schiraldi had only recently moved from starting games to pitching out of the bullpen, and up to that point in the 10th inning, the change had looked like a smart one. 2 quick outs against Backman and Hernandez, 2 of the toughest hitters in the entire New York lineup, made it look like the whole season was about to end quietly and cleanly. Then, almost without warning, everything began to change. Gary Carter stepped up to the plate, and lined a clean single into left field, refusing to be the final out of the season. The Mets were still alive, barely hanging on by a thread. Kevin Mitchell came in off the bench to pinch hit, and he singled as well, moving Carter into scoring position with the crowd growing louder. Then Ray Knight singled too, driving Carter home and cutting Boston's once comfortable 2-run lead down to just 5-4. 3 batters in a row had reached base with 2 outs already gone, something that almost never happens at the worst possible moment of an entire season, and something that no amount of preparation or scouting can ever fully protect a pitcher against once it starts happening in real time. If Schiraldi retires any single one of those 3 hitters, the inning is over, Boston wins the championship outright, and Bill Buckner never gets the chance to make the mistake that would go on to define the rest of his public life. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it genuinely changes how the whole story should be understood by anyone hearing it today. The play everyone remembers forever might never have happened at all if one single pitch, thrown earlier in that same inning, had simply gone a little differently that night. Buckner's error still happened later on, of course. He still has to answer for what he did, or failed to do, with the ball once it finally reached him. But the true story of that collapse does not begin with him standing quietly at first base. It begins with 3 hits in a row that, by every normal expectation of the game, simply should not have happened at all in that spot. And here is something that might genuinely surprise you. After the game ended, when reporters were searching for someone convenient to blame for the disaster, Bill Buckner refused to point a finger at his own pitcher. He never once criticized Calvin Schiraldi in public, not that night and not in the many years that followed. He called the whole loss a team failure, not one man's personal failure to carry alone, and he meant it every time he said it. He had every reason in the world to be angry at the pitcher, who let 3 straight hitters reach base and set the tying run in motion. Instead, he stood beside him afterward and protected him from the very worst of the public blame that was coming his way. 3 straight 2-out hits in a moment like that do not happen often in baseball. It takes real bad luck, real pressure, and real skill from the hitters on the other side. Schiraldi went from 1 strike away from a championship to watching his lead disappear in the space of only a few pitches, and Buckner never let anyone forget that the collapse started well before the ball ever reached him at first base. The next player connected closely to that inning is Gary Carter, the Mets catcher who simply refused to make the final out of the entire season. Carter was one of the most respected players on that Mets roster, a proven veteran catcher who had already built a strong reputation for showing up in big moments throughout his long career. The kind of leader younger teammates naturally looked to when a game got tight and nerves started to show. Boston came within a single strike of ending the whole year more than once during that very at-bat, with the crowd already sensing victory and some fans already reaching for their coats. Carter stood in against Schiraldi knowing exactly what a strikeout or a weak fly ball would mean for his team and for his own season, with the count and the whole season balanced on a single pitch he could not afford to miss. He worked the count carefully against Schiraldi, fighting off tough pitches, spoiling good ones, and refusing to give in, until the count finally reached 2 balls and 1 strike. Then he lined a clean, sharp single into left field, right at the exact moment Boston needed 1 more strike more than anything else in the world. That single base hit kept New York's hopes alive at the precise moment they seemed completely finished. It was the moment Boston's win probability, which had been sitting at nearly 99.8% only moments earlier, began to slip for the very first time, dropping down to about 96%. On paper, written out like that, it does not sound like a dramatic change at all, just a few percentage points on a chart somewhere. But it was the very first crack in a wall that had looked completely solid just seconds before Carter ever stepped into the batter's box. And cracks in baseball have a habit of spreading fast once they start to appear under pressure. After Carter's base hit landed safely, Kevin Mitchell also singled behind him, and Carter came around to score a short time later on Ray Knight's own base hit that followed. Carter's at-bat tends to get forgotten today, buried under everything more dramatic that happened later in that same wild inning. But without it, none of the rest of the collapse ever gets the chance to unfold the way it did, and the whole shape of that World Series would look completely different in the history books. Bill Buckner never once treated Gary Carter as an enemy because of that single hit, and he had no reason to, since Carter had simply done his job under the worst possible pressure a hitter can face. In fact, in later years, he spoke about it warmly as one of the great clutch performances he personally witnessed across his entire long career in the sport. Carter did exactly what a truly great player is supposed to do when an entire season hangs on one single pitch, with a whole stadium waiting for him to fail. He came through under enormous, almost unbearable pressure, the kind that ends careers just as easily as it makes them, with an entire season and a whole city's hopes riding on a single swing of the bat. Buckner respected that completely and openly, even though it came directly at his own team's expense that night in October. That one small moment turned a nearly finished baseball game back into a real, living contest again, and it deserves to be remembered fully on its own terms, not simply treated as a footnote sitting quietly before the more famous plays that followed close behind it minutes later. Carter himself later said he simply refused to be the man who made the last out of the season, and whatever the reason, his approach at the plate that night changed the entire shape of World Series history. Buckner understood exactly what that kind of at-bat costs a hitter mentally, having faced that same kind of pressure himself across 22 long seasons in the league, and he never once begrudged Carter for delivering when it mattered most for his own team. Now we arrive at one of the most overlooked facts in the entire story, and it belongs to relief pitcher Bob Stanley. After Schiraldi allowed those 3 straight hits to load the inning with pressure and doubt, manager John McNamara made the call to the bullpen, and Stanley came in to pitch, with Kevin Mitchell standing on third base and Ray Knight over on first base, both in scoring position and both representing runs that could tie or even win the game for New York. The score at that point was 5-4, still narrowly in Boston's favor. One single pitch later, everything changed again for the Red Sox, and for the entire city watching back home. Stanley threw a pitch that got away from him and skipped past his own catcher, Rich Gedman, all the way back to the backstop behind home plate. Mitchell raced home easily from third base, sliding in well ahead of any possible play. The game was suddenly tied, 5-5, with the crowd at Shea Stadium roaring on every single side of the stadium, sensing that the momentum of the entire series had shifted in an instant. A wild pitch is one of the quietest ways a baseball game can change. A small mistake that rarely makes the highlight reels the way a fielding error does, yet it is every bit as costly on the scoreboard. And in this case, it was the pitch that truly ended Boston's lead for good. Boston's win probability, which had already been sliding steadily since Carter's hit, now sat at exactly 50%, down from a number that had looked almost unbeatable only a short while before. A pure coin flip, after being nearly a sure thing only a few minutes earlier in the same inning. Here is the part that genuinely changes how the whole story ought to be understood by anyone watching highlight reels of that night today. When Bill Buckner's ground ball rolled through his legs a short time later in that very same inning, Boston was not losing a lead that still existed at that point. There was no lead left standing to lose at all by then. The game was already completely tied before he ever touched the ball. Stanley's wild pitch had already erased Boston's advantage, well before Mookie Wilson ever stepped into the batter's box to face him that night. That single fact reshapes the entire conversation about who truly deserves the blame for what happened only moments later. There is something else worth knowing carefully about that very same sequence of plays that night. Some later, more careful analysis of the 10th inning argued that Stanley himself was slow getting off the mound to cover first base on Wilson's eventual ground ball toward the infield. If that particular argument holds up under scrutiny, Wilson may still have beaten any throw across to first base, even if Buckner had somehow fielded the ball perfectly cleanly on the first attempt. Nobody can say that with total certainty all these years later, and the research itself is careful about that point, since so much of it comes down to fractions of a second that no camera angle from that era can fully settle. But it is part of the honest historical record, and it genuinely matters to the fuller picture of that inning. None of this excuses Buckner completely, and it should never be read that way by anyone, even if the out itself was not fully guaranteed by any means. Simply keeping the ball in front of him on the ground might have stopped Ray Knight from scoring the winning run immediately at that moment. Buckner still had a clear defensive job to do on that specific play, and in the end, on that night, he did not do it. But Stanley created the tie that erased Boston's lead completely. Buckner created the lasting picture that the entire baseball world still remembers vividly to this day. After the game ended, and for years and years afterward across countless interviews, Buckner reminded reporters again and again that the score was already tied before that ground ball ever reached him at first base. He He never once stood up in public and placed real blame on Bob Stanley for what happened out there that night. He carried his own share of the disaster quietly, and he left his teammate alone to live with his own part of the collapse. Stanley faced plenty of hard questions of his own in the years that followed, and Buckner's steady refusal to point at him publicly meant a great deal to a pitcher who might otherwise have carried the label of scapegoat instead of him. The next name tied closely to that inning is Ray Knight, and his fingerprints are all over the ending of that game in two completely separate ways. Knight was a steady, hard-nosed third baseman who had spent the season proving he belonged in a Mets lineup full of bigger names, and Game 6 became the night his whole career changed forever. He's not the flashiest player on that roster, but he had a reputation for coming up with big hits when his team needed them most, and October of 1986 turned out to be the perfect stage for exactly that kind of player. He had come to the Mets a few years earlier and had to fight for his place in the lineup. Never quite the star that Carter or Hernandez were, but always dependable when the moment called for it, which made what happened in Game 6 feel less like luck and more like a payoff for years of quiet, steady work. First, it was his own base hit that drove in Gary Carter and cut Boston's once comfortable lead down to 5-4, the very hit that pushed Kevin Mitchell into scoring position for what came only moments later. That hit alone would have made his night memorable, but baseball had something far bigger waiting for him before the inning was finally over. Then, later in that same wild and unforgettable inning, after Stanley's wild pitch had tied the game at 5 apiece, Knight found himself standing calmly on second base, with 2 outs already gone, watching Mookie Wilson battle pitch after pitch at the plate, under enormous pressure. He watched Wilson foul off pitch after pitch, staying ready to break for home the moment contact was made, knowing that a single mistake on the base paths could cost his team everything they had just fought to get back. When the ball finally skipped through Buckner's legs and rolled away, it was Ray Knight who came sprinting around third base and crossed home plate with the winning run of the entire World Series. His reaction in that exact instant, arms thrown up high, sprinting hard toward home plate, leaping joyfully into the arms of his celebrating teammates, while the Shea Stadium crowd roared around him, became one of the single most famous images to come out of that entire World Series, replayed for decades afterward. He was later named the World Series Most Valuable Player for his strong performance across the whole series, not just for that one dramatic inning alone. For heartbroken Red Sox fans watching helplessly at home, Knight's wild, joyful celebration became the lasting picture of everything Boston had just lost in a single inning of baseball, a snapshot of pure joy on one side of the country and pure devastation on the other, captured in the exact same frame of film. It would be easy from the outside to imagine Bill Buckner quietly resenting him for that moment forever afterward. But there is no record anywhere of Buckner ever treating Ray Knight as a personal rival to be angry at, then or later. Instead, in later interviews given across many years, he described Knight as a tough, genuinely clutch opponent who simply did exactly what a winning player is supposed to do under enormous, unforgiving pressure. Buckner's own mistake gave Ray Knight the single defining moment of his entire career, and that strange connection between the two men is real and permanent in baseball history. He and Buckner would cross paths again over the years at old-timers events and reunions tied to that same World Series, and by every account those meetings stayed friendly and respectful, two professionals who understood exactly how thin the line between a hero and a goat can be on any given night, and how quickly those roles can trade places depending on nothing more than where a ball happens to bounce. It was never personal between them, no matter how many times the story gets retold today online with anger baked into it that was never actually there in real life. That finally brings us to the player whose name is most tightly and permanently tied to Bill Buckner's own, and that is Mookie Wilson. Of everyone connected to Game 6, Wilson is the man most viewers assume Buckner must secretly resent, since it was his ground ball that ended the game. And that assumption is exactly the myth this whole story needs to correct. The score was tied 5-5, deep into extra innings. There were 2 outs already gone in the bottom of the 10th. Ray Knight stood waiting patiently in scoring position over on second base, watching every pitch closely. Wilson battled hard at the plate for several pitches in a row, fouling some off and refusing to chase anything out of the strike zone, before finally hitting a low bouncing ground ball toward first base that looked, for just a moment, like a routine play. Buckner moved toward it immediately, glove down low, body bent forward, exactly as he had done thousands of times before across his long career. Wilson's blazing speed down the first baseline was a very real and obvious threat, and everyone standing on that field that night knew it instantly without needing to be told twice. Buckner later explained calmly that Wilson was moving so fast down the baseline that dropping to one knee to safely block the ball never really felt like a realistic option in that split-second decision. He tried instead to field the ball cleanly while staying up on his feet, hoping to make a fast, accurate throw across to first base in time. The ball skipped once off the dirt, then skipped a second time, and then it rolled straight between his legs and out past him into shallow right field. Ray Knight scored easily and untouched from second base, sliding across home plate as the Mets' dugout emptied onto the field. The Mets had won the game 6-5, and Shea Stadium exploded into pure, deafening chaos around them. This is the exact moment that gets replayed again and again, decade after decade, on highlight reels and blooper compilations everywhere across the world, often shown without any of the context that came before it in that same inning. Announcers, fans, and casual viewers who only ever see those few seconds of footage rarely learn about the 3 straight hits, or the wild pitch that came earlier in the same frame. That missing context is a big part of why the myth around Buckner grew so large in the first place. It is fair to say the ball itself was playable that night. It is fair to say Buckner failed to keep it in front of him at the exact moment it mattered most in his entire career. That single failure ended the game right there in an instant, in front of the whole watching country. His injuries almost certainly help explain why his reactions were not as sharp as they once had been years earlier in his career, but an honest explanation is never quite the same thing as a full excuse for what happened on the biggest stage of his life. The mistake still happened, and it still mattered enormously to the final outcome of that game and that series. But here is the deeper truth that breaks apart the entire premise of the story people love telling online today for clicks. Bill Buckner and Mookie Wilson did not become bitter enemies that night, and they never did in all the years that followed either. They became close, genuine, lasting friends instead. In the years after both of their playing careers had quietly ended, the two men traveled together for autograph signings across the entire country, appeared side by side at charity golf tournaments in front of adoring fans, and stood together at public appearances built entirely around the very play that had connected their names forever in baseball history and popular memory. Wilson spoke about Buckner with real warmth whenever he was asked about that night, calling him one of the finest people he had ever known in or out of the game of baseball. He made a point of saying so in public, on camera, whenever the subject came up in interviews over the years. That is not the kind of thing a man says about someone he secretly views as an enemy. Both men understood, without ever needing to say it out loud to each other, that one single baseball play had tied their names together for the rest of their lives, and they chose, together and deliberately, to build something good and warm out of it, instead of something bitter and cold that could have poisoned both of their lives. Mookie Wilson was supposed to be the one man Bill Buckner could never possibly forgive, according to the popular myth. Instead, he became the clearest possible proof that the whole idea of an unforgivable list was never actually true to begin with. It should not be forgotten, though, why Wilson's name became so famous across America in the very first place. It is worth remembering, too, that Boston went on to lose Game 7 after that painful night as well, just 2 days later, a fact that gets left out of most retellings of the story. The entire World Series never actually came down to one single ground ball, no matter how simply the story gets told and retold today for easy clicks. But by then, the public version of the story had already been written firmly into people's minds across New England and beyond, and it had been written almost entirely around one man standing alone at first base under the lights. Years later, that story began to change for the better. On April the 8th, 2008, Bill Buckner walked back out onto the field at Fenway Park. Boston had since won championships in 2004 and 2007, and the old wounds from 1986 had slowly started to heal across the city. Buckner came out to throw the ceremonial first pitch to his old teammate Dwight Evans. As he walked out through the narrow gap in the Green Monster, the stadium rose to its feet. The ovation lasted roughly 4 full minutes. An extraordinary stretch of applause for a single player on an opening day. Buckner became visibly emotional, fighting back tears as decades of public blame turned, in that one moment, into something much closer to gratitude. Bill Buckner passed away on May the 27th, 2019, at the age of 69, after a long battle with Lewy body dementia. Players and people from across the baseball world remembered him for his toughness, his quiet dignity, and the graceful way he carried a heavy moment for more than 20 years without turning it into bitterness. Bill Buckner made the final mistake of Game 6, and there is no getting around that fact. He deserved real criticism for failing to field that ball cleanly when the season depended on it. But he did not deserve to have 22 seasons and thousands of hits reduced to a single play. And he never created some secret list of 5 players he could never forgive. In the end, the man everyone expected to hold on to anger forever chose instead to let it go. And that choice, more than any ground ball, is the real story worth remembering about Bill Buckner.